Hello, I am Chauncey DeVega. You may recognize my voice from Ring of Fire Radio with Mike Papantonio, the BBC, Sirius XM, or the Tom Hartman Radio Show. And you may have read some of my essays at places like Salon and Alternet. I would like to thank all of you for listening to, downloading, tweeting, and sharing the eponymously named podcast known as The Chauncey DeVega Show.
And they ran a story by somebody named Chauncey DeVega.
Quote, I find black garbage pail kids, black conservatives, fascinating.
It's just unbelievable. You know,
he goes by the name of Chauncey DeVega.
You know, I've been called Uncle Tom, Oreo, sellout, shameless, but this is a new one.
Well, let's talk now to Chauncey DeVega.
As my man Chauncey DeVega of the blog We Are Respectable Negroes said,
I have author and blogger Chauncey DeVega here with us.
Hello, good people. Thanks for joining us here on the Chauncey DeVega Show. As we discussed last week, this is going to be our Star Trek themed episode. So last week we did our memorial to the late, great Leonard Nimoy. He was beamed up by Scotty, and now he is stardust. So his consciousness is still with us. We are all connected. This is my Jungian psychoanalytical moment. And that was just, man, a punch to the stomach to lose him. And Sci-Fi did a nice retrospective. Folks are pouring their hearts out. This is an opportunity to talk about Trek, to sit back and reflect upon the social and political context of Star Trek. And I recorded this episode a week or two before the passing of Leonard Nimoy. And I said, we got to bump this one up because I sit down and I've been blessed and really lucky here on the podcast to talk to really smart and interesting people doing smart and interesting things. And so many wonderful conversations have taken place and so many wonderful conversations to come. So I'm really, really excited. You see me basking in the glow. So we had our little debut on iTunes, and I think we climbed all the way up to 30 or something on the podcast list, which is pretty good and the new and noteworthy. So they let you stay up there for a few weeks. So we fluctuate, we go up and down, and that's just my kind way of encouraging everybody to please subscribe to us in iTunes. It's really, really important. Mention the podcast on Twitter and all that good stuff. So in this conversation, David Greven and I talk about Star Trek, politics, race, gender, and sexuality, and just some quick thoughts. And of course, our obligatory opening monologue / promo, human tricks. Alternatively, stupid human tricks. For those of us who walk the racism beat, there's always something to talk about. And my real struggle has always been, how do you separate the trivial from the substantive? Do you just talk about random nonsense of the day, about somebody calling somebody a name, about some ball-dribbling athlete doing something stupid, about silly celebrity culture, or do you talk about macro-level institutional racism, white supremacy, and inequality? And I was thinking about this week because, of course, we had the knucklehead behavior of these white kids, this fraternity in Oklahoma caught on video. And again, folks, don't record all your business doing some racist song where they're chanting the word nigger, nigger, nigger and killing black people and don't let black people into our fraternity. Then they got grandma up there chanting the same thing. And apparently this is on a trip to their Founders Day convention. And if this, apparently folks are doing research and this fraternity apparently is notorious for racism, is it even worth talking about? I know that's provocative to some. Yeah, oh my God, this is an important issue. These are young people's lives and colleges need to be safe spaces and all that good stuff. But in a world with declining resources, where you have institutional white supremacy, and you have a black man as the head of American neoliberal empire, and it's complicated. You have this multicultural neoliberal corporate state on one hand, but you have deep institutional white supremacy on the other. It's a hell of a thing that can boggle the mind. So I'm never suggesting that it's a simple thing. So I was thinking about this, and I actually was talking to somebody earlier today about this. Wonderful conversation again for the podcast. We talked about American political development and race and the color line and the body politic. Just a great conversation. We actually had to take a time out and said, hey, let's pick this up next week to do another half hour. So that was just gold. I got to tell you, I'm really excited about that conversation. And maybe it's not something binary. Maybe it's not either or. Maybe we can think about these sort of moments of knucklehead behavior as being reflective of deeper systemic institutional problems. So I'll give you an example. So yeah, you have a bunch of white college students acting a fool, okay? That's a great example of, again, backstage racism in practice. I don't know anyone who is surprised by this behavior. But on one hand, you have the popular narrative that says, oh my goodness, racism and white supremacy and anti-black and brown racial animus among white people has been declining. A generational replacement will fix this. And today's young white folk are better people, more ethical, more sound, less racist, more progressive than their parents. Well, a lot of the data actually doesn't bear that out. About the spate, if anything, thousands apparently, of racist and bigoted and prejudiced, everything from graffiti to hate attacks on America's college campuses. So on one hand, the hypothesis would be that this behavior is disappearing, that attitudes are changing. Young people are smarter and better, to quote Chris Rock, where he made the brilliant observation about intergenerational white racism by saying, well, maybe today's white folk just aren't as hateful and just aren't as crazy as their parents and grandparents, because Obama did win. And we can't just say it was symbolic change because we have had systemic institutional change in this country too. So on one hand, we have the persistence and residue of Jim and Jane Crow, of wealth inequality, of a grossly racist and classist criminal industrial complex, or prison industrial complex rather. But then you can also think about the rise, if not the destruction of the black middle class, Latino middle class, black and brown professionals, all sorts of things sort of sending mixed messages, never mind a predominantly multicultural popular culture and cultural space around the world. So we got a mixed message there. We got mixed terrain. So maybe it could be that we're seeing this backstage racism that is really a reflection of the deeper attitudes, the real attitudes of not a small amount of the white American public. So then you can connect the dots, as I like to say, between these cops killing innocent black and brown people in the street. Between, and we'll talk about this, the organized debt peonage racket, Jim and Jane Crow thuggery of the Ferguson police, and these mouth-breathing troglodyte white kids yelling about killing black people and using racial slurs. Maybe one is just the more overt public face of this private behavior, and the lesson in the post-civil rights, post-colorblind era, maybe the post-colorblind era, to borrow a term, could just be, again, the massaging of attitudes, the ability to hide racial animus. Learning these scripts, but the attitudes are still there, which begs a really interesting question. I'm not even going to get into the whole thought crime thing because I'm not really interested in going down that sci-fi speculative route. We'll save that for another conversation because I do think it's an important one. That, hey, as long as people learn how to shield their behavior, learn how to keep their racism in private, maybe don't let it impact their behavior. And that's the crutch with implicit bias and unconscious racism, that these folk are acting racist not because of implicit bias, but because of overt racial attitudes. And I actually have a piece I'm finishing for ChaunceyDeVega.com where I'm actually sort of really concerned about the proliferation of the language and term implicit bias or subconscious or unconscious racism, because I'm really afraid it's going to be robbed of all its meaning and intent and will be perversely twisted, as is the style of conservatives in the right wing and others, liberal racists too, in post-civil rights era America, where they take language, they rob it of its meaning, and they make it into something else. So, for example, how now you have a majority of white folk, if not a plurality actually, who believe that racism against white people is a bigger problem than racism against people of color. The creation of fictive language and ideas such as reverse racism, or that when we talk about equality of opportunity, that language has been stolen to mean to make sure that white men have quote-unquote fair opportunities for hiring and promotion because of this narrative and lie about white people being oppressed. So I'm really worried about the language of implicit bias, unconscious racism being hijacked, and I get into that, as I said. And I think a moderate length essay, I'm really working on writing some shorter stuff. 5 to 6 paragraph format is really hard. Let me tell you, those folks who do that for the Times and the Washington Post, LA Times, New York Review of Books, on them people, that's a skill. And it is not an easy one to learn. So the data would actually suggest, again, always trying to be an empiricist connecting the dots, that white racial attitudes among young white folk have not improved in the ways that the general public believes. And as I alluded to earlier, actually a really great interview, I think it was in the Journal of Higher Ed, and what you're seeing with the Oklahoma case is, again, backstage racism, and a racism that is not too different from the racism of these white folks as parents and grandparents. So that's something to think about. Another interesting question, too, in terms of punishing these young people. Slate.com had an interesting piece. I fundamentally disagree with it, although I respect the author, suggesting that the young men in Oklahoma who were yelling racial slurs, threatening black people, and engaging in what I would suggest is terrorist speech. Those are terrorist threats. Using the word nigger and chanting about hanging black people, those are terrorist threats. That perhaps they shouldn't be expelled. Maybe they should be educated. I'm not that generous. I think these folks have learned their attitudes and values, and they're not going to unlearn them. And I said on Twitter, again, we had a nice little exchange, very polite, very cool. And I said on Twitter, expel these clowns. And if I were a parent or my kids were there, black or brown or even white folk of conscience, I would sue the school if these young white troglodyte racists were allowed to stay enrolled. Because I would say you are not keeping my students safe. You have a clear example here of terrorist threats. This is speech as violence, if not a precipitation to violence. These are fighting words. Get these clowns out of there. Another interesting thing to think about just in terms of comparative punishment, and this is little discussed by those folks who are outside of higher ed, outside of university administration, who have not worked in student affairs or student services, that the same disparities that you see in the American criminal justice system, in quotation marks, because there's no justice there, and that you see with little young black and brown kids being punished and expelled in schools, in elementary, middle school, and high school when they're young adults. Those same processes continue at colleges and universities where you have African-American young men, Latinos to a lesser degree, who are disproportionately punished for offenses such as cheating, rape, alcohol abuse, etc. Whereas white kids, white young people in college charged with the same offenses by the student disciplinary board or the school disciplinary board tend to get much lighter punishments. So don't believe for a moment if you had a bunch of black kids running around in college doing a chant about killing white people, that they would not be, number one, out on their behinds, and number two, maybe have the cops called on them. Don't doubt it for a moment. And that's, again, a little discussed secret. And that also gets us to the myth of liberal higher education, especially in an age of corporatization. I mean, so many myths we have to deconstruct. A myth of the liberal media and the myth of liberal higher education. And as I said, it's hard because you work in the racism beat in the color line. The color line is the beating heart of American history and American politics, American society and life. So to understand one, you have to understand the other. You still have sort of the drive-by culture that wants something quick and easy, something for temporary outrage to feed the outrage machine in the news story of the day. But you also need to have something substantive, a positive meal, something meaty, something good. And again, gets us to the serious stuff, like I alluded to before about Ferguson, that it is no surprise to anybody who's been watching this that you had a organized extortion scheme against every black and brown person in Ferguson. That this is a surprise to anybody boggles the mind. But again, I'm not a lawyer, and I don't understand this. Maybe Holder was just playing a deeper game. Maybe is, again, a very accomplished civil rights activist, a man who knows the system, even though he is part of the system, right? He knows its limits and he knows its grasp, even as he leads a system that is reaching out and grabbing and snagging people up. That on one hand, the DOJ releases a report basically documenting continual white supremacy by the Ferguson police, by the Ferguson elected officials, by Ferguson's courts, where they're basically extorting somebody figured this out actually, about $200 a year from every black resident of Ferguson. Think about that. $200 a year from these working class and poor people. And then you trap them in a system and those fines and fees go up to $500 or $1,000. People lose their jobs. It really is grotesque. So you have that, but then you have the same report not exonerating. This is very important. Darren Wilson basically saying that DOJ couldn't get enough evidence to overturn his belief in terms of getting a civil rights case to show that he had a deranged state of mind, deranged or depraved, I think the legal language is, when he killed Michael Brown, to basically say, well, he thought he was afraid, and there's no way to really disprove that he thought he was afraid. And then offering up some complicating narratives in terms of the witnesses as well, if Michael Brown had his hands up or not. And the whole time, and I wrote about this too on ChaunceyDeVega.com, the good folk here in this country who were outraged about Michael Brown, who were outraged about recurring murder and killing of unarmed black and brown people by the police in this country. I think the last stat was once every 18 or 21 hours or 23 hours. Some folks have modified it. An innocent black or brown person, a black person or a brown person who was unarmed or killed by the cops. I mean, this is, again, unconscionable and unfathomable. But given the history of America's police and slave patrols, it is not surprising because, again, the police are doing their job exactly as designed and intended. In terms of the carceral society, creating a situation where black and brown folk and the poor, especially black folk, live in a state of custodial citizenship where they are really limited and written out of the polity. So they're doing exactly their job as designed. But here's my dilemma, and I said this on Ring of Fire radio and TV a few months ago. If you read the report about Darren Wilson in his own testimony where he says Michael Brown has the strength of Hulk Hogan, was like a feral beast, grunting and making monster noises, this begs the question about Darren Wilson's state of mind if he sees black people as demonic beasts who grunt and groan and attack him like demons. And that was exactly his language. Again, that's the language of lynch law. That's the language that white lynchers used when they killed, murdered, destroyed, tore apart, burned alive black men and women's bodies, in particular black men's bodies. Spectacular lynchings by the thousands in the American South over the course of 100 plus years. So there's never that question about Darren Wilson's state of mind, his depraved mindset. So I don't understand how on one hand you can say there's deep systemic racism and bias and white supremacy by the Ferguson police, but that one of their officers who then went and killed an unarmed person in the street for the crime of bumptious walking somehow doesn't exhibit those same deranged racist attitudes. So as I said, maybe it's chess, not checkers, and I'm missing something here. And it also makes me really scared. Because again, despite all the empirical evidence about white and black racism, especially by the police, despite all the empirical evidence about implicit bias that allows, in white racial paranoiac thinking, of course, and encourages white cops and some black and brown cops to kill unarmed black and brown people because they somehow mysteriously see dangerous objects when black and brown folk are holding, especially black and brown men, are holding harmless objects, that how do you crack that gold-plated defense, that Star Trek shield, right? That Star Wars shield around the Death Star, or around the exhaust port. Well, that one had a hole in it, didn't it? Luke was able to get through there with some ray-shielded proton torpedoes. But how do we get through that? How do we crack that nut when you have folks standing up there saying, well, I was in reasonable fear of my life? Because again, the little devil in me, devil's advocate actually, on my shoulder says, well, how come black and brown people who have a real reason to be afraid of the cops can't say, well, I was in reasonable fear of my life when this cop pulled up and I ran away, or I had a weapon and I was home and I defended myself? We know that'll never happen. because we know the carte blanche that police have in terms of exercising violence against the American people, especially against poor people, especially against black and brown people, especially against the homeless, especially against the mentally ill. So that's just a counterfactual thought experiment. If justice really went both ways, and the gross and obvious and expansive police power kill was reined in, and the police were made to be held accountable for their own deeds and actions. So as I said earlier, this episode of the podcast, got into the chase again. Great conversation about Star Trek. And David Greven, great scholar. He writes about literature, popular culture, cultural studies. Really cool interdisciplinary scholar. He is the author of the great book, Gender and Sexuality in Star Trek, Allegories of Desire in the Television, Series, and Films. And he and I talk about, of course, about the phenomena/fiction, thinking about the symbolic politics of Trek and the idea of the other. We also had a fun conversation, too, thinking about all the different possibilities. And I think one of the real strengths of his book is his section where he talks about Voyager and the holographic doctor on Voyager and how he is an allegory for male desire and homosexual identity and coming out. We also talked, too, about, again, the recurring, as I suggest in the conversation, distortion of black masculinity. And this is not my argument. It's actually somebody else's, and other folks have reiterated it. Thinking about how black male characters are depicted in Star Trek as either insane, unhinged, untrustworthy. And David also talks about that, too, in the context of several characters in Trek. So we have a fun back and forth about classic Trek and its representation of race, the Next Generation, and we talk about Geordi and black masculinity and Worf, and then thinking about Voyager. So I don't want to give it all away, but I think this is a good one. So if you're a fan of sci-fi, I think you're going to like this. If you're a fan of Star Trek, I hope you're going to get a new lens and a new way of thinking about the series and thinking about the project and Roddenberry's vision, because it's ideologically mixed. No text is pure. That was one of David's great moments of sharing where he's like, hey, going out there and working on this book and interviewing Star Trek fans, some of them were not as progressive in terms of their politics as he would have imagined. So David and I chopped that one up as well. So this is a good conversation. I'm really excited about it. I think you're going to enjoy it. I know you're going to learn something. That's always what we try to do here on the podcast, Mr. Chauncey DeVega Show. Give you some substance, give you some nutrients, and also have some fun. As I said, David and I have a lot of laughter here, too. As always, I want to thank all of you for listening to, tweeting, downloading, and sharing the Chauncey DeVega Show. Like I said, please go to iTunes. We're on Stitcher. You can find us on chaunceyDeVega.com. And without further ado, David Greven on race, gender, sexuality, and Star Trek. David, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Chauncey. How are you?
We had a little ghost in the machine moment there. We're trying to figure out the wonders of our futuristic technology. I was reading yesterday, I think it came out, where they finally admitted the tech exists. It's probably been around for 30 years. The Star Trek tricorder, or medical scanner. They had a piece online about it, saying they basically perfected some of the basic technology. Whenever I read that, I'm like, all right, William Shatner may be a jerk, but William Shatner was right.
Whatever we say about him on a personal level, he was so magnificent as Kirk.
William Shatner was actually just here in Chicago, and I took a picture of him, and I posted online. I was like, that's what $1 billion looks like.
One thing about him, I mean, everything you hear from his co-stars and everything, he's just kind of insufferable, but he really seems to enjoy his life. He's very vigorous, sort of his own pursuit of his existence, and I kind of admire that.
I do too. He just was walking with this confident strut, and it's like, it's egomania and narcissism, but then you think he's almost 80 years old, right?
Oh, I think he's even older I think he might be in his early 80s. Yeah.
I mean, and I don't know how many virgins he killed and whose blood he's bathing in, but he's just so vigorous. And, obviously we're going to talk about all manner of stuff Trek related and all sorts of good stuff wherever we may go. Even the weather, as I'm jealous of you being in South Carolina. I'm sitting here in the frozen environs of Hoth. Not Boston, but Chicago. I'm somewhere trying to stay warm.
No, when you say Hoth, of course you bring back very fond memories of sort of, childhood abandon to Empire Strikes Back, which was by far the greatest of the original Star Wars films.
And it's also the Hoth base is one of the worst toys I ever received. It was just a big piece of white plastic. That was one of the most traumatically disappointing gifts I ever received as a child. Because I was so excited. Really? I'm like, ooh, I had the AT-AT, and I had all my Star Wars, I had the AT-STs, and I was ready. And I get the Hoth base, and next to the G.I. Joe headquarters, which would just fall apart, you couldn't even put it together, the Hoth base was like the biggest ripoff ever. It's just a piece of white plastic with one gun that would always fall out of the plastic, and it was all of like 2 feet wide. And I was like, how can I have an epic battle on Hoth with this? Childhood pain.
It's not the objet petit of your memory of the Hoth battle.
Now, do you have any horrible childhood gifts that have traumatized you to this day? I mean, if you could make the time machine and go back and tell someone not to get it.
Well, I mean, I feel like I was really sort of bereft of childhood toys. I feel like I should have been given more, quite frankly. But, I do remember the elation I experienced when I got my $6 million man action figure. In fact, I think I had a more sort of idolatrous relationship with the action figure and the merchandising than I did even with Steve Austin himself in the series, because my heart, of course, belonged to Jamie Summers, so brilliantly played by Lindsay Wagner. I really wanted that action figure, but I was too afraid to ask for it. I also have to say that the way they sort of conceptualized the Jamie Summers action figure, she didn't quite evoke, she looked too Barbie to me. She didn't quite evoke the distinctive beauty of Lindsay Wagner. I always felt that was sort of like a poor imitation of the real Jamie Summers. But Steve Austin, on the other hand, there's something really mythic about that action figure.
And we're going to all sorts of meta-level questions about the body and identity and representation. But now, apparently, they have the technology where you can send in photos or apparently even go to a studio, and they'll scan you with lasers to do a 3D rendering of your body, and you can have a custom action figure made. And I'm thinking if I ever hit Powerball or just come into some money, I'm going to get my own action figure made, and I'm going to have them correct certain things. Obviously, have an 8-pack and have all sorts of muscles and make myself taller. Right. But maybe I'll get an accurate one for my own purposes, so I can just worship myself. Maybe that's my own ego, but my own curiosity.
Well, I mean, it's funny because that sounds like a fantastic idea, by the way. But it's funny because I think, with the way technology and also narrative and television and film production is going, all those things are going, today, it's almost as if you can create your own fantasy mythos. Basically, Netflix will eventually just create a series for every individual customer.
Isn't that profound?
So you can basically star in your own Chauncey DeVega, kind of, fantasy scape.
That is troubling on so many levels. One of the folks I just spoke to for the podcast, the Chauncey DeVega Show, the eponymously named podcast known as the Chauncey DeVega Show, is a professional sex therapist. She's a sex counselor. And we were talking about identity and fantasy, and she said something I had never thought about. I'm sure in your work on gender and identity in literature, you've certainly thought about this. But she said, everyone in your fantasy is you. It's so obvious, but it's so true. And then thinking about, technology and Netflix and projection and entertainment. But maybe with new technology, maybe it's something that's always happened, the way that people read themselves into literature. But now we may have the technology to actually make it real in a tangible sense.
Yeah, no, that's true. I'm kind of mulling over the idea that everyone in your fantasy is you. Something I've tried to challenge in my work is that kind of identity politics position that, you look for your like on the screen and that you want to see yourself represented, and also that if you find that it has to be a very positive representation of you. Because I think that people are fascinated by what's not like them. So much of the premise of going to the movies is sort of getting lost in a fantasy of sort of being able to be someone else and have someone else's experience. That seems to me a really vital part of. There's a kind of a difference and an otherness in spectatorship that I think is really, really important as well.
Yeah, and it's the idea, the idea of the gaze and spectatorship, which we're certainly going to talk about a lot. For the listeners of the podcast, I discovered your work in your great book on Star Trek and gender. So first of all, just compliments to your book on Star Trek. And how was it received?
It's been an interesting experience because I think it's had a positive impact. Heard from a lot of people who were sort of intrigued by the argument, spoken to people who ordered the book for their classes, and the reviews have been, strong. And so I've been really pleased with the outcome of it. My initial experience, going to Star Trek fan communities online, I was a little dismayed by what I've experienced as the conservatism of some Trek fans. It's kind of funny, infinite diversity and infinite combinations, the IDIC, mantra that's associated with Spock. I have not always found that in the Trek community itself. So it surprised me sort of the lack of sort of queer receptivity, that I've experienced from some Trek fans. So I think even though, the level of premise of my book was a little bit disturbing for some people because I mean, the argument I was trying to make is that, the whole franchise definitely deserves criticism for failing to represent gay, lesbian, queer, transgender, folks. Nevertheless, there's a powerful level of allegorical sort of depiction of sort of sexual and gendered otherness that I think is really spoken over time to queer people. So I was trying to make that argument, but I found myself getting into a lot of weird sort of arguments and discussions with people that I almost couldn't even get to the thesis part when I was talking to sort of some fans because they were, I got, responses ranging from, why should Trek ever have to represent gay people to, whenever, look at the DS9 episode Rejoined, they showed you the two women having a relationship, or people asking me to interview various people who had produced or written the show, as if I were writing a work of journalism instead of criticism. I mean, the idea of sort of critical readings of a text seemed to be lost on some people.
And I'm also curious, too, about, your discovery of Trek. Was it, okay, the idea came first, then the text, or were you always a fan of Trek, and then you said, okay, now I can apply these critical and analytical frameworks? So sci-fi, and I talk about this with Adelifu Namu, who wrote a great book, Black Space, about, the whiteness and maleness and heteronormativity of Golden Age classic sci-fi. So the way that you talk about race, for example, is by using aliens and robots and allegory. So you look at a text like Trek, and any text, they're ideologically mixed. They're not going to be one thing or the other. There's a lot going on in terms of the intent of the creator, spectatorship, reception of the audience, and so on. And he and I were just talking about sort of these encounters in these spaces that are these quote-unquote geek and nerd spaces, comic book conventions, sci-fi conventions, Trek, Star Wars. Whereas you pointed out, when you actually talk to folk or go to some of the panel discussions or have, given talks like I'm sure you have and I have, some of the hostility to these critical interventions where you're like, okay, on the surface we've made all this progress and Star Trek is so self-reflective and sci-fi is supposed to be so forward-thinking, but why the hell are some of you so afraid of problematizing this text and saying, you know what, our society is racist, our society is heteronormative, our society is sexist. Why wouldn't you think these tensions would be in a text, a popular text like Star Trek?
Right. I completely agree with you. I mean, and I also think that some of the most resonant works across the expanse of sort of film and television representation, and also, in literature, often have terrific ideological disturbances. I mean, for instance, Hitchcock's Vertigo, which I think is the greatest film I've ever seen, I think that there's a way in which, there is a kind of misogyny, at work in the representation of this woman as the eternal feminine and so on and so forth. But, at the same time, what Hitchcock's film does is it shows you precisely the psychosexual logic that is the foundation of those fantasies. And so, to simply say that film is misogynistic is absolutely to miss the point of the complexity of the experience of that film. Again, with something like Star Trek, which is so wide-ranging and so many different kinds of people have contributed to it, it's far too complex a work to sort of designate as having one kind of political sensibility. One of the challenges of being critical and analytical about what you love is that you engage with the work in all of its contours, all of its dimensions, including those that you don't like or that you even find abhorrent, if you find something essentially valuable about that work. For instance, I don't know if you agree with me. I hate Quentin Tarantino films. I know that there are some people who find his films really subversive and resistant, but I find them so troubling. So I wouldn't make I wouldn't, I kind of probably fail my own dictates there because I don't really find the complexity in his work at all. I find it so incredibly crude, the thinking and also the aesthetics of it. As they say on the internet, your mileage may vary, right?
Well, I'm a Tarantino defender in many regards. I'll run defense and say, you get a pass for your honesty and truth-telling because there's no judgment for taste. But that's a different claim than the sort of analytical approaches that one can apply to engaging a text. But in terms of thinking about Trek Online, because I'm really surprised that there would be hostility to your claims, even, granting these assumptions about inequality and sexual and racial and gender ideologies in our society in the West and, around the world. Because I would think Trek would be much more open, especially to folks online, given the popularity of slash fiction.
While it's true that slash is this extraordinary phenomenon, it is its own distinct realm from what I can tell. It's kind of a world unto itself. And in the lot, if you go, for instance, to the Trek BBS, online, you of course you meet some wonderful fans online who are just so incredibly perceptive, and they have a comprehensive knowledge of Trekdom and other sci-fi realms, and you have wonderful conversations with them, which I have. But I've found that there's a lot of very, very reactionary folks who also love Star Trek. I think of Trek as an incredibly progressive vision on balance, but there are a lot of reactionary people who, just people who kind of, they actually, in an unironic way, ogle at the kind of the women in their kind of sexually clad, short skirts on the original Star Trek. They kind of take an unironic view of the series as if, they're not reading against the text. They're kind of just accepting it as sort of a sexist narrative that they can indulge in which they can indulge their fantasies. And so I ran into trouble with just even mentioning any queer stuff to that kind of fan base, because it's like, why are you bringing these gross sexual perversities into a wholesome text like Star Trek? So there's that part of it. But then there were other people, like I said, who just seemed to be at the level of premise. And I think this speaks to a larger problem that maybe even the university system is having, who seemed at the level of premise to have a problem with a work of criticism, that I wasn't actually doing, interviews with the creators of the series, or I wasn't sort of looking at production notes, but I was actually, doing media criticism and close reading. That seemed to be very bewildering to some of the people that I spoke to. Including even the author of a series of Trek novels in which he included LGBTQ characters. He was outraged.
There's a whole angle there, too, as I'm sure you've encountered. I'm a huge Star Trek fan. Star Trek, for me, is more pleasure. Star Wars is a different thing. It's more, critical in thinking for my own personal reasons. So I have that divide. So I think a hell of a lot more about Star Wars, to the point where I can't even really watch the movies passively anymore and just as bubblegum entertainment. But Trek is something I've just loved for years, and we'll talk about its questions about representation and some of the particular examples you've called out in your text about dealing with sexuality, gender, race, and so on. There's so many rich examples. But Trek is fascinating to me in terms of the novels. And as you said, the novels are not canon, and I try to read as many of them as I can. You'll never be able to do it, especially with the ones from the 70s, because people were writing their own books. But it's fascinating with all the new Trek stuff that's come out probably in the last, I would say, since 2004, 2005. Right. They're much more explicit with violence. There's much more sexuality, and they use profanity. Ever since they had the story where the Borg basically came back and devastated the Federation, and that was sort of like the closing story for the Borg, and they did the origin story for the Borg. Some of the new stuff, especially with Data and his resurrection, is very mature and smart in terms of dealing with his issues of identity, about consciousness, about representation, artificial intelligence. But it's really weird to read Trek dealing with sex, because there are quite a few gay and queer characters in Star Trek now in the new novels.
With the New Frontier series as well, I feel like that's a whole other series of questions. I was dealing in my book with the film and the television series, which, as you can imagine, was more than enough to deal with in one book. I think there's a real hunger for sort of reimagining the Trek text, and I think that potential was always there, even in the really traditional Trek series and films. That there was because there's something so protean about Roddenberry's vision, the kind of the endless possibilities for rethinking the social and rethinking self and race and sexuality, right? It sounds like, from what you're saying, the newer incarnations of Trekkian literature are really exploring that.
Some of them better than others, and some are just very superficial, but they're there in a more prominent way.
Much like with Flash, I think, it's probably much easier to do that in a literary context, because when you get into the representation on the air and on the screen, it's much harder because there's so much more anxiety about appealing to the middlebrow audience.
It makes me think too about the families and the marketing and the product. And I think you actually pointed this out in the footnote. The movie First Contact, it was supposed to have a gay character, explicitly out character. I think it was Hawk's partner. And then they basically wrote it out for those fears about how, red state middle America would react at the box office to, my God, the thought that in the future there are gay people. The shock.
I know. And I think the Trek author I was mentioning, to his credit, I think he talked about that. And yeah, I guess what was interesting to me is that if you watch Star Trek First Contact, there's a lot of just really, of course there's no explicit queer anything in the work, but there's something about the way that the Hawk character, who's I think he's a helmsman or something like that, the way he's depicted sort of almost stylizes his appearance. There's something about him that sort of seems he's very kind of buff, but there's a weird kind of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for, a weird kind of idealization of his appearance. Mm-hmm. So I think there's a kind of like a faint residue of the queerness that the character was supposed to be associated with. But then there's also a lot of, and this is what you look for when you're trying to sort of see, is there a queer presence in this text? I mean, there's a lot of stuff sort of with Data's body in the film that I found really fascinating, including sort of all those drills going into his flesh, and then there's also the moment where the Borg Queen basically gives Data an orgasm by blowing on the human skin that she's endowed him with. For me, you look for those moments that kind of maybe subvert the main text a little bit. That's where you find the queerness in a text that cannot acknowledge.
And then too with Data, I mean, he's again a fascinating character. Just never mind the literature, the fan fiction, all that other stuff. Just in terms of the core films and the TV series, in terms of the pliability of his sexuality. Because, when you see the episode you talked about when he makes lore, right? So you see the molds, you see the bodies, you see they're unsexed, they're genderless in terms of physicality. Gender is obviously a social construction, but they don't have explicit genitals. And you could read Data as sort of this polyamorous, polysexual explorer who's just open to experience. Never mind the fact that perhaps, depending on some of the literature you read, that Data is actually capable of modifying his own sexual organs at will.
There's this whole thing from the beginning of Next Generation about, when Tasha Yar, who kind of should have been the first lesbian character in Trek, I think. She was so wonderfully played by Denise Crosby. But of course, she seduces Data when they do that version of the naked time from the original series.
That's right.
Where there's some chemical sort of alteration of their personalities and they all go unhinged. So Tasha Yar seduces Data, and then she says to him, "You are fully functional, aren't you?" So that moment is asking you to imagine, Data's endowment and his sexual capabilities, So there is this weird fascination with Data's sexuality. I agree with you. There's something very polyvalent about it.
And never mind sort of the subtext of his relationship with Geordi.
Oh, yeah.
The homoeroticism and male-on-male desire, fraternity and brotherhood. I mean, in some cases, not even a subtext. And folks have written volumes, obviously, about, Spock and Kirk's relationship. But when you look at original, TNG, Geordi and Data are almost a natural pairing as well.
I have to say, I don't know. It's nothing against LeVar Burton, who's a very good actor. I never connected with Geordi. I just never got that character.
Well, he's an interesting guy. I mean, if you go to the Trek conventions, he's fascinating. I mean, his politics are so direct and so honest, and I have so much respect for him speaking out about police brutality and racial profiling. But I just saw here in Chicago, they had a panel discussion with Geordi and LeVar Burton and Brent Spiner. And they're they're friends for decades, so the friendship is obvious. And they were getting questions about the relationship and about,
Oh, really?
Yeah, like people were hinting around it, and then some folks asked about Geordi and why he was so uninteresting. He basically said I was the black nerd in space, and they didn't know what the hell to do with me. And there was a really hostile question in the evening event where somebody in the audience asked LaForge about Geordi not having any game and what about his sexuality. And then he got really mad. And I don't blame him. The question was so disrespectful. And he said, "You can ask my wife if you think I don't have any game." And then it was really fascinating. So this really awkward exchange. Geordi is a character, and I've talked about this and others have too. So you have this black guy who can't see. He's quite literally blind, but can see through technology, who is sort of immature sexually, mentored by Worf, who is a hyper-aggressive sexual other, who then we find out Geordi has blue eyes, and he's generally only attracted to white women. Who are on the holodeck, who then show up in real life, and he can't actually have a relationship with them. I mean, he's a really fascinating and tragic character in a lot of ways.
It's something I argued in the book. There's a real discomfort with the figure of the black male intellectual throughout Trek. And it's a very interesting dimension of Trek's liberal politics, because the ultimate computer in the original series, and then there's an episode of Enterprise where we find out that the inventor of the transporter, is a black man, but he's depicted as extremely suspect on every level, morally, and also he's a real curmudgeon, so he's not that pleasant to be around. It's kind of a long-standing anxiety about that sort of makes the black male character kind of just problematic for Trek, and I think Geordi suffered from maybe an anxiety about how best to represent him. I think there was, in the 80s context of Next Generation and also early 90s, I think there was this desire maybe not to associate him with too explicit a black identity, because maybe there was a sense that would have been racist or essentialist.
I mean, one of the best parts of the book, and as I said, is just so much fun to read, and it's just so smart. Can you share a little bit, because I was smiling when I read your analysis about Dr. Daystrom. Can you share a little bit about that episode and your analysis for folks who listen to the podcast? He's the inventor of the M5 computer episode. He's, the youngest winner of the Z Magny Prize, and he also played Blackula. So you have this amazing actor in this great episode, but there's so much going on.
What's so interesting is, that actor playing Daystrom in The Ultimate Computer is extremely, he's a very powerful presence. And I think as a result, he threatens to topple the masculine reign of Shatner/Kirk. And I think because of that, there's sort of a lot of anxiety about how to even represent him visually. So I think something I look at is sort of just the different shots in which he appears in contrast to Kirk. And, I mean, Daystrom is sort of this towering presence, and Kirk, in comparison, is really quite diminutive. But the way the series films it, they're always sort of at the same eye level. There's a way in which I think Daystrom himself has to be diminished in the shot, just so that he doesn't look like he's really towering over Kirk. I also think there's something interesting about his sort of, the Daystrom's sort of impatience and imperiousness that's probably worth, thinking about more. And then there's also the fact that, he created this monstrous computer that's threatening to basically rip apart the fabric of the entire Federation. So his creation itself is sort of, monstrous and problematic.
Because Trek, again, you have the Daystrom episode, and you have this problematic recurring theme about, as you pointed out in your work, anxieties about black male authority and sexuality. You have, as you said, the Enterprise episode about the inventor of the transporter. You have the court-martial episode, where Kirk is going to be court-martialed, where the head of the court-martial is African-American. You have this repeated narrative cross-Trek where where black male characters are depicted as insane or unbalanced, directly connects us to the racialization of schizophrenia, and how schizophrenia was a label applied to African-American civil rights workers. So you have this deep recurring narrative where black folks, and even who I love, my favorite character in all of Trek, Avery Brooks, Ben Sisko, thinking about his time traveling, thinking about his moments of having psychotic breaks, actually being put in an insane asylum, to use that language. So you have this pattern over and over and over again. What are some of the patterns that you see in terms of how sexuality and queer, lesbian, gay, and transgender folk are depicted in Trek? Because you talked about two much discussed episodes, the DS9 episode, and then we have the TNG episode with Riker and the Janai.
Unfortunately, I mean, when Trek even attempted to be even quasi-explicit gay rights, queer stuff, and what have you, I mean, I think they kind of stumbled. The Outcast, that episode with Riker and Soren and the Janai, is an example of Trek, kind of stumbling. So the allegory that they come up with, that the Janai are an androgynous race, I love the fact that Picard, Patrick Stewart, of course, when he's announcing that they've gone to the Janai planet, he's like, the Janai, an androgynous race. Sort of like, it's weird to hear it said, this gender classification, an androgynous race. But, there's something it was a very powerful episode in a lot of ways. And I remember when I first saw it when I was younger, I was really moved by it. There's an extraordinary scene where Soren, who's this androgynous character on a planet in which gender itself is outlawed, right? So Soren identifies as female, and so Riker is who's kind of like the very hetero guy on Next Generation, who's the one likeliest to have sort of sexual assignations with women, and during the series. But he's drawn to her, and so she gives this very moving monologue, actually about one of the Janai who identified as male and was attracted to other males. And I thought that was, quite an extraordinary moment in the episode. But then the problem is that the Janai officials get demonized as really repressive. And so the weird thing is that the episode becomes this kind of anti-androgyny, and we could say even today an anti-transgender episode, because the Janai are depicted as kind of monstrous because of their androgyny. And, there's something just really weird about having an episode in which sort of gender indeterminacy is sort of pathologized considering the series is trying to be an allegory for sort of queer rights. It's a little weird to have that kind of emphasis placed. In terms of queer issues, something, again, that's sort of quasi-explicit, like, the Kirk and Spock relationship. I mean, which is not to suggest it's a sexual relationship, but there's a term I would use called homo-affectionalism. Yep. There's a kind of love between same-sex characters that's very powerful and goes beyond marriage or heterosexual relationships. It's very much Leslie Fiedler in Love and Death in the American Novel. The pure marriage of males, sexless and holy. And then, of course, with Kirk and Spock, you have that kind of what Fiedler also talked about, which was sort of interracial brotherhood or, friendships. And then you have Star Trek Voyager, you have the relationship between Janeway and Seven of Nine. I think there were times that they were actually really even trying to appeal explicitly a lesbian/queer audience.
You really saved Voyager for me, because I was not a Voyager fan. And then reading your book, I was just struck by, number one, like I said, sort of the level of analysis, but all these thematics that were there, all these questions that were not present because my own taste and my own superficial reaction sort of pushed me away from seeing some of these currents. The whole thing, too, and again, thinking about identity and sexuality and humanity, the holographic character, the Doctor, is just so powerful in that regard.
No, they did an extraordinary job, and so did Robert Picardo with the holographic Doctor, and sort of just the ethics, sort of his personhood always being contested. Character arc is very much, I think, an allegory for a gay man coming out, having this, just in the typical sort of way that these things are perceived. When gay men come out, there's this sense that they're finally able to have an adolescence, which they had been denied, and so there's a period of sort of acting out and, kind of euphoria, but also maybe immaturity, and then a kind of a resolution, a kind of a mature sense of self, and then also there's a movement towards real political activism, because the Doctor, of course, ends up fighting for holographic rights in a manner that puts him really outside of the community of human beings that he works with. So there's a lot of really fascinating stuff there, because it's sort of like the Doctor joins ACT UP or something, and he starts to be critical of his straight allies instead of just doing what they want him to do. So yeah, it was really, and then you have another character whom a lot of people hate, Neelix. My best friend Vicky Zavalis always had a soft spot for him, so I was forced to kind of rethink the character. But Neelix, as I argued too, is sort of an interesting gender bending figure too, because he's sort of associated with nurturing and with affection and selflessness, and he's sort of depicted as a male mother. Mm-hmm. So you have these queer characters, that you can sort of find amongst the secondary characters of the series.
And what do you say to folk? And I'm doing an end around here because we started with this and I didn't get an answer because I was so fascinated by our conversation. That's a good thing. How did you fall in love with Trek? Was it a case where you had the theory and you wanted to look at a text, or was it like, man, I've always been a Trekker or a Trekkie, depending, and you were like, yeah, I want to find a way to write about this. So how did it happen for you?
Okay, so you're asking me, how did I fall in love with Trek, or how did I decide I was going to write a book about Trek?
Well, they're sort of cousins to one another, right? So it could be, I love this thing, and now I'm in a position because I have the language and the theory to write this book. Or it could be, hey, I got the theory, and now I'm looking for an example, and this is such a powerful cultural phenomena, I want to talk about it.
I definitely felt that Trek spoke to me, especially once I got to college, actually, because when I was living in New York City, they used to start showing Trek episodes at 11 p.m. on channel 11, 9? Which I think it was channel 11, which I think is now, is that? Oh God, I'm trying to remember what I think that might be the CW today. I started watching, the original Trek, and I got really hooked on it. Just the tone of it is so affecting, because it's so, all of the landscape, every time they go to a new planet, it's always haunted and lonely, and there's something kind of abject about it. And I don't know, really, I don't know what it says about me, but that always spoke to me, the loneliness of space in the original series. I think over time I started to think that was where there was this queer connection, sort of the deep loneliness of sort of growing up queer, especially in an earlier period. In all of my work, I think what I try to do is to reopen a question, destabilize a commonplace. And it occurred to me that the whole question of queer representation of Trek seemed to be settled for so many people. There seemed to be the sense of Trek is just too homophobic to show gay people, or they're too uncomfortable with that, and you're just never going to find representation of gayness, so that's always going to be a problem. I was struggling with this. Okay, how do I make sense of the fact that this is so resonant for me? All of these narratives. How do I make sense of the fact that I feel this profound connection to this text, even though on some level it's disacknowledging me? To tease out the implications of that seemed to me really interesting, and I think that was just sort of the impetus for the book.
But thinking about, the same sort of thing for folk of color, too, and women as well, I mean, it's Bell Hooks. I remember reading Bell Hooks' Black Looks, and thinking about my love of sci-fi and Star Wars, saying, okay, we're not in the film until Billy D shows up, although Vader is coded as black. We can talk about that, too.
Right.
Like, man, you love sci-fi, you love this stuff, but you have to read yourself into the narrative and use your imagination. Be like, okay, the text doesn't want me. It doesn't know what to do with it. But I have a sense of ownership, and I know that there's something else going on here, and I'm going to read myself back into it. So you fall in love with this thing. So I'm smiling, too, thinking about how small the world is. So we're talking briefly, I'm trying not to laugh, about Channel 11. So coming from Connecticut, thinking about, we had Channel 11, which showed Kung Fu Theater, had all the really cool cartoons in the morning during the week, because back in the 80s and late 70s, you could watch all the Hanna-Barbera stuff. That was cool. But then you had like Star Blazers and Thunderbirds. Then later on, you had Robotech, which came on Channel 11 and then repeated on Channel 9. So you got a twofer of Robotech, which was my excuse to skip school. I'd always find reasons to quote unquote be sick, so I could watch all the cartoons and I fake an illness. And then on Channel 9, I don't know if you recall this. Do you remember on Channel 9 the Michael Bay show?
Remind me of what that was about.
Michael Bay, or Richard Bay, not Michael Bay. He was.
I was about to say Michael Bay, the hideous.
Oh no! Richard
producer.
Bay. There you go, Richard Bay. And there's a documentary about him. And he was sort of like the Morton Downey Jr. type, but just a hell of a lot smarter. And he would have these horrible competitions on his show. Like one of them was every year they would do Mr. Puniverse versus Mrs. Thunderthighs.
Oh, no.
You can go online and watch them. And I'm just so happy for YouTube to be able to go back and watch this stuff. And that was on that was probably like 85, 86, before all those stations were bought out by the big cable conglomerates.
For some reason, that perverse programming is not ringing a bell.
You suppressed the memory.
No, but I mean, so much of what I grew up with is still so resonant. Like the ABC afternoon movie that they would have, and they always showed those, magnificent Ray Harryhausen epics and Godzilla and Gamera, and which I adored. And I'll tell you something. I think the pop culture of my childhood was pretty extraordinary. Of course, Channel 11 had Twilight Zone marathons, and of course now things are so different. But when I was a kid, they always showed a lot of classic Hollywood films. It was such an education to be able to sort of inhabit those other eras on television, consistently. I mean, people are so, especially in academia, are so incredibly judgmental about television. I just the other day, I was talking to a colleague who said that she's never had a television and never raised her children with television, like it's some kind of nuclear contamination or something. And I just think about myself, especially, sort of being a part of an immigrant family, sort of working class. Television was such a powerful, cohesive, cultural system and education and also community.
I could ask you who you voted for, and most folk are not going to be able to tell you. I can ask you about something specific about public policy. The mass public is ignorant. But if I ask you about a sporting event or about a TV show or about a movie, I'll bet you'll get a response. And that's the collective subconscious. Racial ideologies, gender ideologies are reproduced in the spectacle, in mass popular culture. And I feel like folks who say, well, I will never let my kid watch TV. I'm like, well, in a lot of ways, you're raising your child to be illiterate. If you think of it, it's a certain kind, we can have a whole debate about sort of a post-literate society, but they're not going to be literate in terms of sort of what moves and desires and the real things that drive, I would suggest, mass popular behavior, and where people are learning lessons about politics and life.
It's just also, developing a kind of flexible understanding of human behavior. I don't know. I mean, maybe people might say representation is not. It's not authentic. You're not going to really learn anything about being human. But I mean, I think that I don't know. I've learned a lot about sort of human emotion and sort of just the experience of sort of intersubjectivity, through watching films and television. I think, especially growing up gay but not being able to talk about that. It's sort of being able to live through characters and narratives was very, very powerful for me, because it gave me access sometimes to experiences I wasn't even able to have. I think that there's something really powerful about that. I really do think that popular culture shapes us, sometimes in really pernicious ways that we have to fight against. Judith Federley's whole theory of being a resisting reader, I think that's also important at times. I do think that academia, has inherited this sort of Protestant anxiety with the visual and even with representation itself. So there's a lot of sort of distancing from that because it's not good enough kind of thing. And I mean, I think that academia has a real problem in terms of just dealing with the vitality of film and television sometimes, just the intensity of that kind of, and you can also you could extend that to hip hop and to punk and other kinds of media. But I mean, there's something about the Dionysian intensity of representation that I think makes a lot of academics extremely uncomfortable.
And then depending on your field, then you get into these questions about interpretation and methodology and how do you approach these cultural texts. Old school empiricists would be like, how do you quantify the experience of watching a TV show, or how do you come up with a definitive analysis that we can evaluate and develop hypotheses about and confirm or disconfirm about cultural text? And I'm just always curious too, about how fellow travelers respond to this question. So what would you say to a listener? Huge question. So what would you say to a listener or a student, or in your own experience, I'm sure this happened, when somebody says, why are you spending all this time talking about these cultural texts? In your case, you have the Trek book, but also your other work and literature studies, masculinity studies. Or a student who's like, you guys are just reading too much into this. All that stuff can't possibly be there.
If you think of sort of artistic expression as not just important, but also meaningful for you, I think you're going to want to have some means of engaging with it. It doesn't have to be through criticism. I mean, that's what I do, but I mean, some means of taking that experience further and sharing it with others. I mean, for me, criticism is about community building, and also, sometimes it's about making an intervention. Sometimes it's about, dealing with the political realities that we live with as well. What is representation doing for us that way? But I mean, for me, it's, I think Nathaniel Hawthorne, the American writer I love the most, he said, I seek intercourse with the world. That's why he writes. And to de-emphasize the sexual pun of that, I mean, I think when you're writing, you're seeking intercourse with the world. I think it's a way of engaging, it's a way of communicating with people.
But have you had any moments trying to give students sort of the analytical tools to have these conversations where you have to get over the disbelief and the suspicion, or are most of your students already they've already bought the ticket and they're on the train, so winning them over isn't too hard?
Oh, I mean, I've had such a diverse experience pedagogically, you know. I mean, I have some students who've, you know, become friends, and they work in the industry, and they're extraordinarily talented, either screenwriters or filmmakers. So they were always hungry for that. You know, there are certain students that I've had that just sort of a dreaded moment of, don't you think we're reading too much into this? I think what I've just done is to just say, yes, we are reading way too much into this. and if we didn't do that, we wouldn't have a class. There would be no reason for us to be here. What we're trying to do is to find evidence in the text for our views of what's really going on here. So, you know, I do think that there's a lot of resistance from certain students, especially with the kind of the tightening and narrowing of the university experience today, that it's so much about the pragmatic realities. I mean, you know, it's really to the detriment of us all.
And it's sad too. I mean, it's neoliberalism and austerity and the right wing move in this country attacking the university because it's one of the last places where there are, you know, acts of resistance. And there's a great piece, I think it was in Critical Theory or Critical Inquiry, basically looking at neoliberalism, and the claim would be that if you're looking at what's happening with higher ed, the destruction of tenure, the elimination of academic freedom, surveillance through evaluations, the professionalization of students in the sense of saying, okay, we don't need the humanities. What's a deliverable? We need to make you, instead of homo politicus, we need to make you homo economics, and that's all that we care about. And then thinking about, you know, the way that you actually have right-wing folks like the Koch brothers and others buying universities, buying departments. And then what a friend of mine told me about this, I had no idea this was going on in Texas for years, which is not a surprise, these moves to allow legislators to evaluate syllabi in publicly funded schools.
Wow.
It's almost McCarthy-like. And then when you, add the adjunctizing of the profession where you're destroying people's lives. And it's just, as I said, these are perilous times. And instead of having university creating active citizens, as you pointed out, they're making consumers. And then you're teaching the evals, especially if you don't have tenure. And then you have students saying, well, how's this going to help me get a job? How is this sort of thinking going to, you know, help me pay off my loans? How is this sort of class have any value for me in terms of money? And it is really disturbing.
No, it's very disturbing because, I mean, the imagination that is sort of stimulating an interest in literature and film and television is just being squelched. And it's sort of the kind of desperate materialism has never been more powerful than it is right now. And it's sort of, you know, I think as all of us involved in the university have to work together, have to work across disciplinary lines to preserve intellectual inquiry as, you know, a really, really powerful part of, you know, being a human being. I mean, I think it's just, I mean, I hope it lasts. I hope we're able to do this because it's sort of, it would be a real shame if it got, you know, eroded to the point where it wasn't even feasible to have a university anymore.
I mean, never mind with, you know, and the New York Times had a great piece about reimagining the university and the claim, of course, stuff you're familiar with, and I am, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners are, about flipped classrooms and technology and trying to use these massively on, you know, MOOCs, massive online open classrooms, which really does a very good job of anything in terms of pedagogy and student learning. And, you know, it's an interesting moment, you know, coming back to Star Trek, you know, we're in the future in a lot of ways, and we have this hope, but, you know, technology can be a blessing and a curse. But I know you're pressed for time, and just sort of winding down, there's so much we can talk about, and I'm sure that's why I always try to tell folks, leave something on the table for next time. So anytime you get to talk about sexuality and Trek, you have to take the chance and do it. I mean, it's a fun conversation for all the ghetto nerds and others out there. But two quick questions. We opened up when we were, you know, getting our technical problems resolved and our banter back and forth, talking about the weather in South Carolina, all that good stuff. And you mentioned The Walking Dead. So I have to ask a fellow traveler. Number one, are you a fan of the show? I'm a huge fan of the comic book, not so much a fan of the show, but I do watch it.
I love The Walking Dead. I feel it's got the austerity and the power of the Book of Judges. I think it's a great television series.
Now, how do you think the show is handling, because, again, our own informal conference online as we're working through ideas, what do you think of the show's handling of questions of masculinity?
Well, you know, I do think the first two seasons were, you know, especially powerful in that regard, and I think you had the whole conflict between Rick and Shane, and, you know, it led to some really extraordinary moments. There was this brilliant episode from season 2 called 8 Miles Out that was directed by Ernest Dickerson, who used to be Spike Lee's cinematographer. And it has all of these allusions to sort of classic horror films and so on and so forth. But what was so fascinating to me, Rick and Shane have this kind of, their conflicts really come to a head. And what was so interesting was Dickerson's and the screenwriters, I guess, and the actors' uses of the zombies as sort of horrifying representations of sort of male aggression, and also even sort of the bewilderment over gender identity. It's an extraordinary episode to watch that way, because it really used the zombie allegory to sort of dissect issues of masculinity and, aggression and violence, which unfortunately are so relevant to, contemporary times, right? So I thought it was really amazing.
I mean, and the series is really, there's a whole running conversation there about the representation of Black and African-American characters on that show.
Yeah.
We have, the whole magical Negro question. We have Michonne and the way that she's been depicted. I've argued online and elsewhere as sort of this superhuman negress huntress who's quiet and brooding. Never mind the T-Dog situation where you have the black man who exists just to be a chauffeur who doesn't even have a name. And then you have the whole thing that just happened with Tyrese where they finally killed him. So my running joke about the show is, are they, they only have 2 black characters on at a time, male characters. Who are they they kill one, they got to bring another one in. So they still have 2 extras right now with surplus. But again, it's an ideologically mixed text, in some ways very progressive and smart, other ways very regressive and conservative.
Tyrese, and the actor who played him was really wonderful. I mean, I thought Tyrese was a very interesting character, and I think there was that combination of sort of, because he's a large, man, he's got a lot of physical power, but then he was, I think, the gentlest character on the show, and that there was, sort of something about him. There was a sort of gender fluidity about Tyrese that I found appealing. Mm-hmm. I think it's unfortunate that he had to be dispatched. I love the actress who plays Michonne. I mean, I agree with you that there is something problematic about her being the magical, Negro.
Yeah, the comic, as I said, it's different but the same. And the writer of the comics, one of these comics, number one, I don't think it's jumped the shark yet. It's getting a little close. But there was a really interesting debate in the editor's pages, like the letters to the writer, or letters to the editor. And he's really good in terms of responding very honestly and very thoroughly. So in the TV show, they have a scene, they made a choice where instead of having Michonne be raped by the governor, they choose a white woman to be raped. And in the comic, it was Michonne who was gang raped. And you had these really interesting back and forth in the letters page where people are like, oh, you're a racist. Why are you having Michonne be raped? And then you have other folks saying, no, that was good because you had the courage to do it. And then they had a whole other debate about Tyrese's character and Michonne in terms of interracial relationships. And how come you have Michonne being with a black man? And he had this wonderful response, the writer Kirkman. He said, I think that black people can have love too. And they can have love with each other. And it's funny that no one ever writes in the complaint about white characters having sex with other white characters.
Right.
I mean, the letters of the editor there are just so smart. But when I was watching the governor scene, I was like, are they going to go there? Are they going to go there with, this gang rape of a black woman by a character coded as white, but in the comic he's Hispanic. He's a white Hispanic in the comic. And it's just really interesting to think about how folks negotiate that history and the choices with the writing. And I wonder if they said to themselves, they had to say, we're not going there on TV because the backlash would be too great. They just had to have had that conversation because if they were sticking with the comic, they would have had a very different outcome.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is that, profoundly violent encounter that Michonne and the governor have where, she kills off his zombie daughter.
Yep.
Just as a sidebar, there's this obsession with the zombie girl that's kind of across the board. But the violence of that just seemed really interesting to me because it was sort of, the white man and the black woman are sort of facing off as if somehow both racial and gender struggles could only be sort of negotiated through a kind of mano a mano epic battle. It all came down to this physical strength that each had.
So, David, where can folk find you online? Future work in progress, things to look out for?
I'm finishing up a book for SUNY called Ghost Faces. It's about post-millennial Hollywood masculinity. And I'm also finishing up a book on Hitchcock called Intimate Violence, Hitchcock, Femininity and Queerness. And I'm working on a book on masculinity in the 19th century called The Failure of American Brotherhood, all about sort of the way that authors represented masculinity and sort of group male identity, in extremely skeptical ways. So I'm keeping myself busy.
That's going to be my next observation. Be like a man who is prolific and efficient.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I really appreciate your kind words, and it's so fantastic to talk to you. I imagine it must be a really electric experience to be your student.
I don't know if they were saying electric in the sense of getting electrocuted and punished, or electric in terms of invigorating.
Electric in terms of, electrifying.
And I think your students are probably, as I said, more than thrilled and learning so much. I mean, you're prolific, you've written so much, and certainly in the future we'll have to sit down again. But I couldn't resist an opportunity to talk about Star Trek at length. I mean, and the book is just so fun. And both, as a Star Trek fan, it's a fun book, but also in terms of seeing how you take these concepts, core concepts from gender studies, film studies, sexuality, and apply them in a very transparent and readable way. So I can certainly see why folks would want to assign the book. It really is a wonderful read.
Well, thank you so much, Chauncey. I really appreciate that.
Fun conversation. I want to thank David one more time for sitting down and chatting with us about Star Trek and gender and identity. And it begs the question, too, and David and I went back and forth on this, when you try to talk to folk and try to explain to them that popular culture is political, that it is an insight into our collective subconscious. Sometimes you get a lot of resistance because people don't want to think critically, number one, about anything. Two, they want to turn their brain off when they sit down before the TV or film or listen to music. And our politics are all around us. It's animated by and through us, especially in terms of questions about identity and representation. So to talk with David about Trek, to have that to and fro that I hope and know in my heart is useful and valuable to the listeners, all you guys, and also to fans of Star Trek. It's just really, really exciting intellectually. But I also feel like we're doing some really important work there. Because if you can help folk to see how race and racial ideologies and gender ideologies and questions about sexuality and justice and identity are reproduced through popular culture, where popular culture, we let our defenses down, we let our guard down, and we're still being socialized into certain values in a very sort of unreflective and unthinking way. And that's why popular culture matters. That's why it matters in terms of sitting down and talking to your kids and turning their brains on in terms of asking them hard questions about what they're listening to. Asking your black and brown kids and asking your young girls, your daughters, and your sons about the types of lessons they're learning about themselves and value and identity from things as seemingly innocuous as Disney films. And God forbid you're letting your kids watch BET or watch these horrible housewives shows or watch horrible shows that basically profit off of black and brown folk acting badly. I'm so grateful, as again, always give an honor to my parents and the people who mentored me. I do that all the time because I think that's important that we send that energy out to them. I'm so glad my parents basically let me watch anything I wanted on TV and watch any film. They didn't let me watch, porno movies or anything, but I snuck a few in there. Hint, hint. But reading comic books that I wanted to, my parents never said, oh, that's too adult for you. With one or two exceptions, as I've talked about before. One is Saturday Night Live when Eddie Murphy was doing the routine where he had the women with the diaphragm in. My father thought it was funny. My mother told me to go to bed. And then when I wanted to watch the Hagler-Hearns fight, and my father said, you're too young to watch this sort of violence isn't for kids and it'll hurt you later on in life. Those are the only two moments I can really remember being told I couldn't watch something. And they said it with a tone of voice that I just sort of said, fine, I'll see it another time. This is before the internet, so I had to wait to capture those gems. And Hagler-Hearns is still a fight that just disturbs the hell out of me. It's a really hard fight to watch, even for a boxing fan like myself. But thinking again, as I said, as parents and as adults, we have an obligation to teach our kids to be critical consumers of popular culture. But how can a lot of our parents do that, and adults and others, when they are mindless consumers themselves? When they're not asking themselves about the lessons they're learning about their own personal self-worth, about politics, about values, and about identity. So I mentioned the brother in the last episode and also in this conversation about Star Trek. We're going down that geeky road. We're going down to the Ghetto Nerd set. Adelifu Namu is the next guest here on the podcast series. He is cool people. He's a professor. He writes about African-American cultural politics. He has two really cool books out. The third one he's working on. One is called Black Space, which is about African-Americans, race, and science fiction. He also has another book out about comic books and popular culture. And he and I just it's kismet. But Adelifu and I talk about race, the color online, the whiteness of science fiction. We talk about Django, a lot of time talking about Django. So that was a wonderful, wonderful detour. Masculinity, our love and how we rationalize loving sci-fi. And we have a fun little anecdote there about being two black kids growing up and thinking about the comic book store and thinking about geek culture and how somehow we felt that we were not allowed or accepted in it. So a lot of stuff to chew on and learn about, and wonderful conversation with Adeli Funamu. That's going to be the next episode here on the podcast. So we got the Star Trek episode, which was this episode, which was awesome. Again, thank you again to David for being so kind and patient with your sharing and your insights and your teaching. Adeli Funamu, that brother, he and I chop it up on the next episode of the Chauncey DeVega Show. And as always, like I try to tell people, it's nothing but love here and a lot of fun. And I so enjoy this project, but it does take time. It does take energy. The average episode takes about, 2 to 3 hours to put together in terms of editing and listening and re-listening and trying to pretty stuff up. So we've got expenses in terms of opportunity costs, and we have great supporters here on the podcast who donate twice a year during our annual fundraiser. We got other folk who throw money in periodically, and I love and appreciate all of your effort, all of your support, all of your kindness. But for the rest of you, if you can, because tax time is coming up, you're getting that tax money. I know Judge Mathis says people always say they're going to pay you back when they get the tax refund. It never happens. So this isn't that scenario, but it is hands open. If you got some, go to chaunceyvega.com, $1, $2, $3 if you appreciate the podcast. Throw it into that PayPal link. That would be greatly, greatly appreciated. And as I said, this weekend, I will be on Ring of Fire on their show on the Free Speech Network. You can watch it online. You can download it. It'll be up on YouTube. If you have DirecTV, you can watch it as it happens. This show is broadcast several times over the weekend, so that's awesome. So I'm really thankful for that opportunity. And again, thank all of you for giving me the courage and the wind at my back to say, hey man, when they ask you to do these TV deals, do them. Go for it. Enjoy them. Speak a little truth to power. So again, I want to thank all you guys. And once and again, you can download the show, follow it on iTunes, Stitcher. You can go to chaunceyDeVega.com, and I appreciate your sharing, your downloading, and your tweeting about the Chauncey DeVega Show. And as we always say as our closer, and I'm so happy that it's warmed up here in the 50s and our little animal friends are out scurrying about, getting extra food, getting hugs, getting attention, getting yummies that I have been storing up. Some of my bird friends, I threw them some bread. They're like, man, this stuff is stale and old. You expect us to eat this? So I had to go get some barbecue chips for them. So as always, please be good to each other, treat each other well, be kind, be patient, and be nice to our four-legged friends, our winged friends, our reptilian friends, and do something nice for someone in your life. And again, call someone. I always tell people this because it's important. Call someone that you haven't spoken to in a while, reconnect, and also tell the folk who matter to you in your life that you love them. So until next time, I want to thank you for listening to the podcast known, the epononymously named podcast, I gotta say it, known as the Chauncey DeVega Show.